All right, we're going to now move in. I guess I should say thank you, Dr. Hamilton. We're going to now move into the part of our discussion with Q&A. And I'm going to start with the first question, and it's for all three panelists. And the problem is very clear. We have a water scarcity problem, a growing water scarcity problem, both with surface water and increasingly now moving forward with the inability to pump groundwater to replace the lost surface water. The solutions are pretty straightforward. You outlined some of those. But the solutions aren't simple. What are the barriers to the solutions, and how do we overcome those barriers? And I'm going to start at the end of the table with Jeff, and if others would like to chime in, I'd love to hear their comments as well.
The question was, what's the big barrier to getting this done? What are the barriers? Well, we're running upstream against a political environment that doesn't value agriculture. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody in this room. And if the blueprint plan was only to save the San Joaquin Valley, I wouldn't be a huge optimist about its prospects. We got to try. But it turns out that, when Hinton Helper strolled through California in 1855, there was really nothing in Los Angeles either. A couple thousand people, that was it. And we built this world-class city in Southern California, in Los Angeles, San Diego, basically on an imported water supply. They have 3 sources of imported water. They got the Owens Valley, which is a relatively small and shrinking supply. They've got the Colorado River, and all you got to do is open today's newspaper and you see what a disaster that is for them. And then they got the State Water Project, which is the water out of the Delta coming down the California Aqueduct. And they got, the last 3 years, they've gotten a 5% supply. And they built up a certain amount of stored water over the past 25, 30 years, and they're burning through it fast. And it turns out that the same solution that we need, that Scott's described, that we're talking about in the blueprint, is the same solution they need. They've got to get more wet year water out of the Delta, and they're limited as to the places they can put it in those wet years, and we have the storage. And so, what the challenge is, and I'd much rather be hopeful, and I think we've got some reason, we've got some opportunities to have a breakthrough here in terms of actually making some fundamental changes in direction and policy, because what's happened just in real time in January around Christmas and then the last couple of weeks, huge amounts of national press on all this water going out the Golden Gate Bridge and the pumps being throttled back. And that's a fish regulation, and there was nothing they could do about it, so they said, and they couldn't. The courts have backed up. The Endangered Species Act is one of the most one-sided laws ever conceived by man. You may not do anything to harm the species, and this operating plan said you've got to send for 2 weeks this water out of the Delta. You got to flush it, and you're limited on pumping. And so it's, what's the barrier? The barrier is that we'll forget. We won't make progress, and we'll go back to kind of the old way of doing things, which does not work for us. And so I'd say politics is where and politics in the best form, taking care of people, is the opportunity and also the biggest challenge from my perspective.
I agree with everything that Jeff said. I would just add to that we're going to need, the dairy industry has been very progressive. I'm not familiar with it, as I'm probably the least familiar with it of anyone in this room. But it seems to me from a distance that the dairy industry is very progressive. You've been heavily regulated for a long time. You've been very proactive politically. There's a lot of other industries that haven't been so engaged, but we're going to need a very big investment to move this fairly ambitious set of projects forward. We've been looking for $4 million for a pilot project, and in a year and a half, probably, that Jeff and I have been looking for that, we haven't been able to get it from the states, from the federals. So we're going to need a lot more political support, and that's going to require more money. But just, we talk about $4 million for a pilot project. In January, my estimate was that we lost $50 million worth of water out the Delta. Right? That's what we lost, $50 million worth of water, if you had to buy that. And yet we can't get the money for $4 million for a pilot project. So I would say one of the barriers is, we need more money.
Right. I think just the last thing to add is, and to really sit on, is being forward-looking, right? And saying, okay, where are things going to be at? How do we make sure that we get there? And like we said, not forget what's happened in the past, so we can do that. Regulatory barriers for everything is always a hard thing, and change in regulation is tough. And even though it's set that way, so being vocal, being active, and yeah, really touting the dairy industry as a model in California of how to do things right, and showing that to folks. And I think when people understand that and they get that, and like, okay, yeah, we're willing to work together, and then being able to do that.
Thank you. I've got a couple of technical questions on the economic side. So these are initially going to be for Dr. McCullough, unless others would like to chime in. If high overdraft areas lose water and lose land value, what impact will this have on the local?
That's a great question. So what's going to happen to state and local taxes as we lose value? And that's not something we looked at. It could be big, right? And that's something that we definitely need to dive into. Certainly if you're looking at communities, and we've done that in some other studies where we looked at, especially specifically in the Tule Subbasin, looking at the impact of Sigma on those communities, and it's big in certain areas, and I don't think it's not a happy thing to think about, but I don't think it's unrealistic to think about there's going to be communities that are going to disappear. And that has implications for everyone around, right? So when you're seeing some of these communities go away because the agriculture in the area that they depend on goes away, where are they going to go to? And typically it's going to be to the cities to find jobs. And so everyone should be interested in this, right? Everyone should be concerned with what's going to happen. Yeah, that's it.
Anybody else want to add anything? Got another technical question regarding the study. Study showed and confirmed what we know in the industry, that there's about a 1% increase in production every year going forward. The study also showed that there's going to be impacts to the production side of the dairy sector. So I think the question, what it's getting at is, you've got all this additional milk production that's happening naturally. We're going to have some impacts. We're going to have fewer cows here in the San Joaquin Valley. How does that net out at the end of the day in 2035 and 2045 or 2040? Is there a net increase or a net decrease in overall milk production?
It's a great question. I think what we show in particular wasn't building in the 1% increase every year. So I don't know. I couldn't answer that right off the bat. I do want to go back. I was teaching in class this week talking about Malthus and the Malthusian theory about increasing population and how agriculture wasn't going to keep up with it, and that was going to lead to starvation. And I think this is a testament to why that's wrong, is that you see increase in technology and productivity offset any of those other increases. That's definitely where we're going to have to look to maintain margins and maintain productivity in the industry. But I couldn't answer what it's going to be net. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a perfect question for Dr. Hamilton. Why is the Delta smelt so important? What does the loss of their presence indicate?
Delta smelt are only important because they are endangered. They were once they are a native fish, contrary to what you might have heard. The delta has been substantially changed over the last 150 years. They've essentially lost all of their native habitat. They're now trying to survive in a totally different ecosystem to what they evolved in. But more particularly, the delta has been inundated with introduced species. One of them is another little fish that fills that same niche in the food web, right? So delta smelt are little fish about as long as your little finger. Their sole purpose in life is to be eaten by other fish, right? So they're just a layer in the food web. And now that layer has been replaced by the inland silversides. So from a biological perspective, they're essentially irrelevant. There's essentially none left except the US Fish and Wildlife Service are now artificially propagating and putting about 50,000 delta smelt back into the estuary each year. But we have the Endangered Species Act, and as Jeff said, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter whether the fish is important or not. The Endangered Species Act says we cannot allow species to go extinct. And it doesn't matter what the economic cost is, we need to protect them. So, our challenge is how do we maintain our water supplies given that we've got all these endangered species in the delta?
We've heard a little bit of the discussion about groundwater recharge and its importance going forward. Can you talk a little bit more about the opportunities and the importance to dairy? And I'm going to start with Jeff, and I think Dr. Hamilton may have something to add to that.
Importance of recharge? Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's like the importance of oxygen. If we're going to use the groundwater basin, there's got to be a way to get more water in it. Water can't just go one way. So, I mean, we got some challenges how to get it there and all that. I think actually, in context of the discussion in the blueprint, the water banking opportunity, and Scott Hamilton was very involved in developing the Kern water banks over the last 25 years, and they've been very successful, and we basically need to replicate that a little bit north. And so Scott, why don't you talk a little bit about the water bank, the Kern water bank, and kind of how that works a little bit?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about water banking before, but just to back up a little bit to the big recharge question, right? So what Jeff said, right? The way that we've got to be thinking about the groundwater basin now is like a bank, right? We're only going to be able to get out of it what we put into it. So there are multiple ways we can put water into the groundwater basin. Hopefully you've all started to hear about on-farm recharge. Some farms are well suited to that, others are not. But it's a great way when we have these really high flows coming off the Sierras. It's a great way to capture that flood water and get it in the ground. We've got artificial recharge ponds. You've probably seen those around that the water districts operate. And there's sort of two kinds. There's those that are dedicated. They essentially just look like a reservoir on your farm and have, essentially four sides, no habitat. On the Kern Water Bank, what we did was something that was a lot cheaper than that, and that was a big motivation, is that we just essentially put up a U-shaped levee. And so as with that filled with water, we had some parts of the pond were like 3 or 4 feet deep, and then it just feathered out to nothing. That provided really great habitat. And while the state government has sort of been reluctant to put money into certain kinds of recharge, they love the idea of these multiple benefit recharge ponds. And if you're upstream from a rural community, then you've just won the trifecta, because you're putting groundwater in the recharge basins, in the groundwater basin, you're creating habitat, and you're helping disadvantaged communities. And there will be quite a bit of federal or state money to help do that. So I don't really have a lot more to add, but this is truly, one of our, I would say it's our most precious resource. Our groundwater basin and the water we put into it is our most precious resource. We cannot be sustainable in agriculture without looking after that resource.
Thank you. I'm going to pop back into one more technical question, then I'm going to get to what I call the political questions that always come in any discussion like this. So it's not surprising that we're here in Tulare County today, and the economic report and the work you presented today, Dr. McCullough, shows that some significant impacts could happen right here in Tulare County. Obviously, there's a lot of cows here, and so some of that impact is going to be felt here, and it looked like maybe even as much as half, 48% I think was the number I saw on the screen, of the impacts could be occurring right here. So recognizing, though, that there'll still be a lot of cows here in this area, and I think the question is getting at recognizing that, are we going to start to see feed move from areas where it was historically grown to areas where there's going to be increasing demand, from the north, to the southern parts of the valley where there's lots of cows? Is that going to be one of the implications of Sigma in terms of how these impacts are played out?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that at least putting in the model, I guess when we're thinking about feed, it's, how wet is it, right? And how difficult is it to transfer? And so at least from a modeling perspective, when we were looking at it, we said, okay, let's take 30 miles around a dairy. That's as far as you're going to transfer your silage. But other feedstuffs, yeah, we're already shipping a lot in. There's implications for that. I think we saw that when we had supply chain disruptions and rail disruptions when you're shipping in corn from the Midwest, and what that means. But yeah, having a more mobile feed system, I think, is going to be really important. That's definitely something that's going to factor into it.
Okay, now we're going to move into the political discussion. So the first question, I think it's a great one, is Sacramento waking up to the need of more water projects for water use in drier years? How can we impress on them the importance of having that ability? I'm going to start with Jeff. Don't look at me like a deer in the headlights.
Well, I think we all know the political environment that we operate in California. Basically a one-party state. So there really isn't any upside in being all that critical of the governor. And so I'll let other people be critical of the governor. I want to point out the positive things that the governor's done. He actually has had 2 major initiatives on water since he's been governor. When he first got elected, he spent a lot of time and had the whole state bureaucracy work on developing a water resiliency strategy. And then he updated it in July with a water supply strategy. And at the blueprint, we looked at what he's put on the table, and they're all good things. For example, in the valley, we got 2 million people. There's 40 million Californians. So we got 5% of the population here. 95% of the population is not here. And a good chunk of that's in Southern California. And how are they going to be sustainable? They got to spend a lot of money on water recycling. They still send well over 1 million acre feet a year to the ocean themselves out of their sewer plants. And that needs to get recaptured and reused and recycled. It's massively expensive, but they've got to do it. So that's part of the governor's plan, is doing that. So that's all good. The reality is that in order for water recycling, and I'll just give you a little hint. The Colorado River water supply, which is the backbone water supply of Southern California, is 800 TDS, 800 parts per million of salt. When water goes into an urban community, but it goes in fresh. So if it goes in straight from Colorado River, it goes in at 800 and it'll come out at 1,000. It picks up 200 parts of salt as it goes to the sewer plant. Water that shows up at the sewer plant at 1,000 cannot be recycled and directly served because it's too salty. Water, 1,000 is the limit. You can't be over 1,000 and serve it to an urban community. So their baseline supply at the Colorado River for Southern California is very salty in terms of using it to recycle it. So in the Chino Basin, which is where I was from, they banned Colorado River water from coming into Chino already in the 1980s. Why? Because all of the Chino Basin sewer water ended up in the Santa Ana River, and that was Orange County's drinking water supply. And they put it in the ground, pumped it back up, and then they recycle it. And the water that comes out of the Delta is about 200 to 250 parts TDS. So that's the water they need. So if you back up, you look at the governor's plan to spend billions of dollars to recycle, he needs more Delta water. Or not only does he have to just clean it up, they got to desalt it too. So you see how start to see how these things connect. Now, it's important that the governor and his people understand that we're all connected, that we are important, but we're important to the whole. I mean, not to mention the fact these people like to eat too. So, the politics, you can get frustrated. I've been frustrated. We've all been frustrated. But I think we've got some opportunity, and I think the governor's got further aspirations politically. I don't think that's a big surprise. The rest of the country politically does not look like California. And so if you're going to go and run on a national scale, having a record of actually solving problems is probably a lot better record to run on than other things that a California governor might run on. So I'd say, it's up to us to kind of be, smarter than your average bear and figure out how to position these things smartly to be able to make some progress. And so that's my response to your question.
I'll give 2 cents worth with 40 years of experience working with state government in Sacramento. First 7 of those as a staff person in the Capitol. Supervisor Pacheco and I were talking about that when we were both very young. We were working in state government, and now the last 33 years on the outside, working on behalf of the dairy sector and other corporate clients. Water policy has always been a topic, and the discussion about more water has always been a topic in Sacramento. It ebb and flows, as you would expect it would, like any political issue, and it flows heavily when there's a drought. And the discussion the last few years has been about how we get more water. And then once we're out of the drought, it ebbs a little bit for a number of years. And that's just been the cycle. Unfortunately, because of that, not a lot gets done. But we're reaching a tipping point. And so I think, and not just on water, on other issues as well, energy costs and other important issues. And so I do think that there is going to be increased attention, and with that attention comes some opportunities, and it's just being prepared. And I think the blueprint is that preparation. So I'm hopeful that, we continue to communicate these solutions. We can get the funding to make them happen, because, a lot of these solutions are not inexpensive solutions. One of the other questions that came up is a quick one, and I'll try to respond to this, is why is hydroelectric power considered non-renewable? And that's true. Large hydro in California, over 20 megawatts, is not considered to be renewable in the state. Small hydro is. And for years, that was a fight in Sacramento, and still should be. It's clearly clean power. But as we move forward, the fight is less about what's renewable and more about what is carbon-free. And hydro, like nuclear, people are recognizing, is carbon-free and actually has a role to play as the state tries to decarbonize. So I think, the answer to that question is I beat my head for years trying to convince people to make hydropower renewable. I don't know that it matters as much anymore because it is going to get counted towards California's clean energy future. So I think that one kind of, in its own way, solved itself a little bit. So I want to read this question. We've heard a lot of information today about the current status of the water situation in California. We've also heard about its impact on the dairy industry currently and moving forward. What are the Water Blueprint's plans moving forward to improve the situation? So this is a nice follow-on for Jeff and Scott, who are involved in the blueprint politically, and kind of fits with what we were just discussing about what's the time frame for all of that.
I think I drew the short straw here. I think it took us a long time to recognize the opportunities here. We had been thinking about the idea of taking water, underneath the riverbed probably 10 years ago. And of course, a lot of people had a lot of questions about it. Were they going to block up? What were the vertical velocity rates? Can you put it in the delta? How big does it need to be? Is that economically feasible? And over the last 10 years, we honestly, when we started on this, we had no idea if it was really a good idea or not. We sort of started until we came to a fatal flaw. Well, 10 years into it now, I am more optimistic than I've ever been. I think this really is the solution for the water crisis in California. And essentially every other project really depends on that particular project working. We can have more surface reservoirs, but we've got to have water to put in them. We can achieve far greater sustainability of our groundwater basins with recharge basins, where we've got to have water to put in them. We're not going to get nearly enough water just from our capturing more flood water off our east side rivers. That will solve maybe 10 to 15% of our problem. The rest of it's got to come from the delta. So, it's so frustrating. We had a meeting this week with Antonio Villagrosa, who's essentially the infrastructure czar that the governor appointed. He, over the course of an hour and a half, it became apparent to me that he really bought into the idea, right? The state had done they'd got a lot of the elements right. They have realized the importance of recycling, of capturing more stormwater, of groundwater storage, but they had missed this critical point of how we get more water out of the delta. And without that, nothing else really works. Westlands is putting a lot of effort into aquifer storage and recovery, through greater use of their wells. Again, that doesn't work unless you've got water to put in it. We've got the Kern Water Bank essentially sitting dry right now and has been really for 10 years because we haven't had the water to put in it. And it's all because of the endangered fish. So I guess that's a long way of saying, it's taken us a long time to get here. We need now to adapt the technology in the Delta and proves that it works in the Delta, and that's the $4 million pilot project that we're talking about. Jeff and I have been working, Jeff is sort of an inspiration to me because he sort of prods me when would really just like to sit at my computer and do something else. But we have met with a lot of people throughout the state. In Sacramento, down in the southern part of the state, from very influential people. We've got several fairly high-profile meetings coming up. It's frustrating how long it takes just to sort of get people to change the way that they think, to introduce a new solution. The idea, the acreage we need in the Delta is not that great. It's a couple of 100 acres. I mean, honestly, if, I don't know how many farmers here have actually had to put in a trial drain system, but a farmer would put that in 6 months, right? It's going to take us a year to do the first level of environmental documents, at least a year to do the second level of environmental documents, and then we've still got the lawsuits, the funding, and all that sort of stuff. I mean, the solution is 5 to 10 years out, 5 is being extremely optimistic, and 10 is probably more realistic. So it is not a near-term solution. One of the, I need to be careful what I say here a little bit, but unlike the tunnels, this really is a solution for all of California. The tunnels are very expensive. It's like, okay, yeah, we all want a Lamborghini, but we can't afford a Lamborghini, right? And that's sort of how I look at the tunnels a little bit. It's like some of the more affluent places in the state, that'll be a great project for them, but it's not going to work for most of the valley.
So part of my job is to keep Scott moving forward and optimistic and hopeful. He's a tremendous resource. When he talks about 10 years, Scott came to the blueprint. See, the blueprint is really, we call it the coalition of the willing. You have a meeting and who shows up. And so a bunch of us started showing up, and we worked intentionally to try to get all parts of the valley represented in the blueprint. And they keep coming to meetings, and we've got the technical committee, which has been really, I think, done a fantastic job of actually coming up with a solution that it turns out it's not only what the valley needs, but what California needs. And so we're out there and we're telling the story. The blueprint itself, as any volunteer, kind of grassroots, up from the ground organization, it took a while to get itself organized, and it's had great support from the dairy industry. The dairy industry's kind of been a backbone supporter of it, and I appreciate the confidence that you guys all have. And when I'm there, I say, hey, I'm representing the industry, and I feel like I'm part of the industry, and I am, and you guys are, and that inspires others to come along. And so there's a lot of participation and hopefulness in the blueprint. But the blueprint really needed to get professionalized, and formalized. We set up a board that was kind of 2022 was to actually appoint an official board. So we got 21 board members. I'm a board member. Scott's a board member. Christina Beckstead's a board member from Madeira Farm Bureau, and you would recognize a lot of the names. And now one of the things we're working on is to hire some professional management that's project management oriented, and we'll stay tuned. We've got a board meeting next week, hopefully to finalize that relationship, and then there'll probably be some announcements on that. But it will take the blueprint to the next level in terms of its professional management and actually advocating this. When Scott talking about this, this fish-friendly diversion, that's there's a bunch of Kern County state water contractor agencies that started working on this 10 years ago, and they brought this idea to the blueprint, and of course, that's now become incorporated into the blueprint plan, and they've spent the money on the consultants and done all the testing. And Scott himself, he's a humble guy, but he's got, I believe, 6 peer-reviewed scientific papers on the Delta smelt. He's a true blue expert on this. So we have some strong confidence that this will work, and the blueprint is the vehicle that we can all get behind and bring this thing forward.
All right. I've got 2 questions, and I'm going to turn the microphone over for a few brief comments in a moment to one of our guests. One of the questions that I have remaining is talking about environmental groups and some of the bad policies that are coming out of Sacramento. And so I thought I'd share, those of you who didn't read the LA Times yesterday, there was one of these reports that came out from an environmental group called Food and Water Watch. And the LA Times and Politico and a number of other publications wrote stories about the report. And it wasn't really a new report. They basically said the same thing last year, and now they formalized it with a few more pages and re-released it as we're dealing with the drought. And, it had a number of concerns and conclusions. And one of their concerns was, all the almonds we grow and export here in California and the dairy sector and how it's using all the water, and we don't really need the dairy sector, and made a number of recommendations, including, that we limit the size of dairy expansions and new dairies in California. It also suggested that we shouldn't be recycling water or desalinating water off the coast or, in the Inland Empire where we desalinate brackish groundwater. So it's just shocking to me the craziness of where the environmental community is coming from. Why wouldn't we want to recycle all the water that we possibly can? It's a precious resource, and we ought to be maximizing its use and reuse. And I think we know about recycling on our dairy farms. We don't use water once. We use it 4 or 5 times before we use it again as irrigation water to water our feed crops, and the cycle starts all over again. So the question gets at, how can we get all of these co-ops and organizations to come together and unite to fight against these bad policies and these environmental organizations? And I think the answer to the question, I'll start, and if anybody wants to chime in, they can, is we have and we are. It's one of the reasons why we're here today, and understanding the economic implications and being able to communicate those to elected officials and policymakers is a big piece of that. Historically, Dairy Cares has been involved in water quality and air quality, climate and animal welfare, and increasingly we're hearing a lot of concerns about water supply, and so we're starting to get more engaged in water supply issues. We're not trying to replicate any of the other organizations that have been working on these issues, but together with the Cattle Council and others, we think we can provide some critical information to those other organizations who've been working on these issues for a long time. And I think that's going to be really important. But the bell has been rung. This is the beginning, certainly not the end of our engagement and involvement in these issues. We think there's more economic work that's going to need to be done, not just on water supply, but on water quality implications that are coming to the dairy sector in the next few years. We've got climate implications that we've been dealing with since the passage of 1383 in 2016. And these all have implications that we're working on. So as things evolve, we evolve with them, and we evolve at the will of our board of directors, which is dominated by dairy farmers here, right here in the Southern San Joaquin Valley. So I think, the answer is we're doing it. We can always do it better, and I think, we're trying to arm ourselves as best we can. I don't know if anybody on the panel wants to add anything else to that answer. And then the last question, before I turn it over to one of the staff or one of the elected officials in the room to offer a few comments. The elephant in the room is always going to be the Delta, and we know that. And I know there was a lot of frustration this year with the amount of water. Those of us who live in Northern California, I think, throughout the state, we had a number of atmospheric rivers that came through between Christmas and the middle part of January. I sat in my house and looked out on my back patio and watched the water continue to get closer and closer to my back door. Whoa, we're moving. In any event, how are we going to ever get those pumps to move all that water south? I know there's a lot of frustration. We lost some water out to the ocean. Probably, some of that was needed for the flush, but probably a lot more than what was needed and actually benefited the fish went out. So, Scott, I think it's a good question for you and Jeff and possibly Dr. McCullough, but if you want to give a little bit more on how we capture some of those peak flows.
Thanks, Michael. Let me go back to his first question, though. that really had to sort of do with the environmental perspective and how we take that issue on. I grew up on a sheep and wheat farm in Australia, a couple of 100 miles southwest of Sydney. We had no groundwater. We had no surface irrigation system. We totally depended on the rainfall. We had like 3 inches of topsoil. People generally, I would say, well, first of all, I think most of the people in California are just oblivious to the natural resource that is the valley. Right? They do not realize how unique the valley is, the depth of the topsoil, how rich it is, the benefit of having the Sierras to capture the snowpack, the ability, the good water quality that is under the valley floor. People don't realize how special this is, and it infuriates me when I hear people say, "Oh well, we don't need to grow all these almonds in California." Well, right now maybe we don't need to grow all these almonds in California, but the world population isn't about to stop growing, right? People need fresh milk. Everybody wants fresh produce with a small carbon footprint, right? They want it growing in their back door, but they can't see far enough ahead. And to me, and it just kills me, like you look at entities like the Bay Institute, right? Their sole purpose in life is to preserve the ecosystem that is the San Francisco Bay, right? They don't actually care about anything else in the state. And I think the challenge for us is to put that human face on the rest of California, right? To make them realize that there really is something here that is more than just a packet of almonds. And so, the work that Michael's doing, the really progressive stuff that the dairy industry is doing is really important. 150 years ago, nearly 2/3 of the population in America worked on farms. People understood what it was to grow food. They understood where it came from. People don't generally understand that now. And I think that's what we've really got to communicate. At the end of the day, I think we can get this done without like NRDC and the Bay Institute. At the end of the day, like this last drought has made the water crisis in California real. And as Jeff said earlier, it has hit Southern California hard. So yeah, we might be only 5% of the state, but when we align with Southern California, now there is a political force where I think we can get things done. And if the Bay Institute wants to like put all their marbles in the bag that there's going to be more water coming out of the Delta, when 20% of that water would essentially solve the California water crisis, I think they're going to end up looking really bad at the end of the day. Totally missed your second question. What was the second question? Oh, and the solution? Sure. Yeah. The idea of like this sort of new paradigm of taking water out of the bottom of the water column is really simple, right? It's a very simple concept. Our engineers have had a really good look at it. There's really no reason why it can't work. And it really, I think, represents a much different solution. People have been diverting water from underneath riverbeds for 100 years in California, in the United States. But only with Turlock's idea of sort of building it in the dry where it's a lot cheaper has this really switched to become a solution for the Delta. So I'm really optimistic.
You always, I think if you look at the politics that really does govern what gets done and doesn't get done. I was talking to a guy who worked for the Federal Fish and Wildlife Agency, and he came from Florida, and he got repositioned to California, and he was shocked at the adversarial relationship between farmers and fishermen that exists in California. He said in Florida, the fishermen and the farmers are on the same page. Culturally, we're very similar. They wear extra tough boots just like we do. But in California, the fishermen have teamed up with the environmentalists. And this has always been a mystery to me. You know, I mean, if we impact fish in agriculture, I mean, we're sorry. We didn't do it. I mean, the fishermen did it on purpose, right? I mean, they catch fish. And that they're in league with the most extreme environmental groups has always been a fascination to me. And then the in-Delta folks, and I know some of you might even own land in the Delta, or you got friends in the Delta. I know we got some dairies in the Delta and had some robust conversations. They are always they have been very concerned because the original planning for the state and the federal, the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project, they always had the water comes down the Sacramento River or up the San Joaquin River, and then it gets into the Delta, and then it heads out. And really there's nothing between the pumps and the Pacific Ocean except freshwater outflow. If there wasn't fresh water, there would be salt. The ocean would come in. So the original plans always had some sort of a bypass facility around the Delta. And the people who operate in the Delta, very, very, very concerned that if we built a bypass around the Delta, if Southern California basically built a bypass and they could get their water around the Delta, that they wouldn't care what happened in the Delta. And so the water quality in the Delta would get bad, and it would affect all these farmers. So the landowners in the Delta politically have lined up with the environmental community, and they've opposed, and I mean, they to this day hate this tunnel idea, and they are going to oppose it all the way through. The blueprint's not going to get involved in the tunnel discussion. Where these fish, we probably need two 200-acre sites for the fish-friendly diversion. They're in the Delta. One probably in the southern Delta, close to the pumps, one maybe in the central Delta. There's no reason for the Delta farmers to oppose this because we're not abandoning the water quality in the Delta. This would be good for them. And so the blueprint actually is deliberately working right now as we speak to develop a direct communication channel with Delta landowners and Delta leaders and Valley leaders, because we ought to be on the same page. We're in the same family. And so I think the blueprint's, got a real opportunity here. If we can mend the fence between the Delta farmers and the Valley farmers and get on the same page, and then you incorporate Southern California support for that, you start to see the political alignment occurring that can start to really move the needle. So that would be, at least, that's a snapshot in time. Is it going to get better from here or worse from here? Probably depends on what all we collectively do.
Thanks. And so I'm out of questions. I do want to thank all of the elected officials' offices. We had congressional staff here today. We had state legislative staff here today. So I am going to give the microphone over to one of those legislative staffers for a quick second here. Vivian from Senator Shannon Grove's office. State Senator Shannon Grove wanted to offer a few comments. And so.
Thank you so much, Michael. My name is Vivian, and I'm the District Director for Senator Shannon Grove. Just wanted to quickly introduce some of my colleagues. Jessica Jansen is District Director for Assemblyman Vince Fong, who is a Vice Chair of the Budget. We have Perry Finzel with Speaker of the House, Congressman McCarthy. We have Eric Coyne with Senator Melissa Hurtado's office, who is the Chair of the Ag Committee, and we have Brandon Harriman and Clayton Smith from Congressman Baladeo's office, who is a dairy farmer as well. As you may know, Senator Shannon Grove represents a lot of Tulare County. In fact, we have Fresno and Kern County as well, which are the top 3 food-reducing counties in the nation. In terms of the water blueprint, we've had a chance to meet with Scott several times. He sent over the blueprint last year, and we sent that to the other 39 legislators. And the reality is this, the Central Valley, we're there's a huge bipartisan effort, right? We understand the importance of water. We understand the importance of, our dairy products, our food products. That's the lifeline of the entire state, if not the country. Not just, obviously, sustainability like food for people to eat, but also the economy. With that said, the bulk of the other legislators in California do reside in the northern and southern parts. And I say this as a joke, but quite literally, I come from Orange County, and in Orange County, some of our carrots just come from cans. There's no water involved there. And that's the reality of the conversations that we need to be having. So as part of some of our, talking points, but more calls to action, we are very cautiously optimistic on where things are going this year. With historic flooding or, deluge of water that we've seen, with our governor's ambitions, with all of these other conversations that highlight the state of California and the problems that we have here, there's a real opportunity for us to make those conversations happen, right? So if I may, today the PPIC had a poll that said, what's the most important issue that faces California? And almost unanimously, it was inflation. And inflation includes supply chain, all these things that I don't understand and don't have the expertise to share. But bottom line is people can't afford their milk. They can't afford their eggs, they can't afford their bread, and they're very upset. So the attention falls back in Sacramento. Those who aren't supporting this now have a lot more pressure. This is your opportunity, number one, to unite, collaborate with each other. Even if there's competing interests, set it aside, walk together, get up to Sacramento, or our new call to action is bringing those legislators here. Again, Senator Grove has shared this blueprint with her colleagues up there as of last year. They understand it conceptually, but they haven't seen it. They don't understand that you, for the last 40, 50, since the Dust Bowl, you know how to conserve the water. You know how to make things work. But at some point, if there's no water, there's nothing you can do. And when those lands are fallowed, and when the farmers leave, and when the cities, disappear from California, they're going to have a real problem, and it's on their hands. So take this moment to, number one, unite and equip yourselves with talking points, because we will have legislators in the Central Valley, and they will listen to you. If you have the capacity to entertain them at your dairy farms, that would be a really good start. If you have stats and numbers like all the stats from the first speaker that I walked in, where it had, we're losing $1.3 billion, I think. Sorry, I don't remember the numbers. I have it written down somewhere. But, have those numbers ready, because they care. The economy speaks very, very loudly to the average constituent, and those constituents are keeping these legislators in office, and they care. So I encourage you, number one, please unite. Number two, equip yourselves with actual information so that when you do have a chance to speak to these legislators that do not understand the Central Valley, that you can have a conversation in real English language, right? Like to the common person who doesn't understand how water works and how important it is. Thank you so much. And we're here. I'm happy to share my cards, but we're just a phone call away. We are advocating bipartisanship. We have a lot of those things in place, but we are not reaching the right people, and we don't have we're not equipped with the same hands-on experience that you have. So please share that insight with us. It's very valuable to us. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me conclude today. How about a round of applause for our panelists today? Again, cards have the QR code if you want a copy of the report, copies of the slides. As soon as we get a video produced, we'll put that up. People want to share this with other groups, it'll be available, or for those who couldn't attend today. Let me also thank our refreshment sponsors, Hilmar Cheese and Producers Dairy. Steve Shahadi is with us today from Producers, and Chuck Allum is with us from Hilmar Cheese. Thank you both. There's lots of milk. Please take some with you if you'd like on your way out. We have more in the refrigerator behind. Let me also thank the California Cattle Council, California Creamery Operators Association, and Dairy Cares for co-hosting. And let me thank the California Cattle Council, Dairy Cares, and the Dairy Environmental Justice Fund. I saw Gerben here earlier as well, who provided the funds through CARES for the industry's half of the cost of doing this initial work. This is just the beginning. We intend to do more work on these issues. But we wanted to get a good assessment of what the initial look is as to what the economic implications of this are for the industry. We've got other challenges, as I mentioned earlier, and think we're going to want to do some more economic work looking at all of those challenges and what impact that's going to have on the dairy sector and on Valley agriculture. So unless there's anything else super pressing, I want to stay on time, and I think we are right at 3:30. So we started on time and we ended on time, and that may be a first for me. Thank you all.